Good morning, everyone. It is right up at 11 o'clock Central. We're going to go ahead and get started. We have a lot of content to take you through today. Thank you for joining SSE here to discuss submitting CMMC Level 2 self-assessments, what and when you need to know in order to be prepared. I am joined today, I'm Bob Duffy, COO here at SSE. I'm joined by Charlie Shudo, our CISO and CTO. He has a few more logos there under his name than I do. Elizabeth Niedringhouse, our president and CEO, is traveling and couldn't be with us this morning. But what we intend to do today, as discussed on our last webinar, is take you all through more of a tactical deep dive into these CMMC self-assessments that are going to be phased in starting in just a few days. Quick background on SSE. We were founded back in 1966 by Susan S. Elliott. That's Mrs. Elliott there on the screen. And really since the 80s and the advent of the PC, we have grown and evolved. Starting out primarily in training and IT services, helping small businesses set up and manage their networks and infrastructure. In the 2000s, we developed our cybersecurity expertise and also became a DoD contractor, which we are still to this day. That really led to us having expertise in multiple cybersecurity frameworks in order to support different DoD contractors and subcontractors. We do have a quality management system in place via ISO, and humble brag on Charlie and his team, we are already CMMC Level 2 certified via a JSVA completed last November. So what we're going to do today is we're going to give you a quick overview of the CMMC rulemaking, what's happening right now, going to dig into the ecosystem updates a little bit, and then I'm going to hand it over to Charlie, who's going to dive into the self-assessments, what you need, how you're going to submit them, etc. I should say that we will be sending out this recording as well as the slides to all registrants afterwards. We also have a Q&A down at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to submit a question throughout, please do so, and Charlie or myself will answer it as time permits. So a quick update on the ecosystem. There was a Cyber AB town hall last week, and Charlie and I were also out in DC the week prior to that at the CS5 East Conference, which is hosted by the Cyber AB. It's their big annual show where they're going through all of the requirements, regulations, a lot of interesting topics and discussions going on there. But some of the key takeaways and some of the questions were being asked coming out of that. Is the government shutdown impacting CMMC? No. Obviously, certain aspects of the government are not working, but DoD and Cyber AB received specific permission to continue moving things forward. To date, there have been 431 successful Level 2 certification assessments completed. This is about half of 1% of the total companies that are expected to need CMMC Level 2 certification. There's another handful that have achieved conditional certification status and another 100 plus that are in progress. There are now 83 C3PAOs. These are the organizations that can conduct the formal certification assessments. Obviously, that number is going to continue to grow, but why this is important to think about. If you are or your organization is planning on pursuing CMMC certification via a C3PAO, there is a 3 to 4 month lead time currently. So engaging with the C3PAO now, looking ahead several months from when you want to go through a certification assessment is key. And SSE, we do have relationships, NDAs in place with several C3PAOs and can help discuss that and make an introduction as appropriate. So a quick update on the rulemaking. Bottom line, CMMC is here. The phased implementation starts on Monday. Looking back, there was a Title 32 rule that we've discussed a lot in these sessions. It was published late in 2024 and took effect. Think about that as cementing the requirements. This is what they are, they're not changing. The Title 48 rule, which was just published in September and takes effect 5 days from now, that deals with the enforcement. how these requirements are going to be phased into government contracts and programs moving forward. Quick refresher on those requirements. The CMMC model calls for 3 levels. Level 1 deals with FCI, federal contract information. This is made up of 15 controls with 59 underlying objectives. Level 2, about 80,000 companies are expected to need level 2. These are the same 110 controls, 320 underlying objectives of NIST 800-171. We're going to hone in on that level for this section because we're talking about submitting CMMC self-assessments, and we're going to hone in on phase 1 of the DoD's phased implementation schedule as published in the Title 32 rule. So what does phase 1 mean? Phase 1 requires that a CMMC self-assessment for level 1 or level 2 be submitted for new contracts. Now, it is up to the contracting officer's discretion as to when these contracts will have that CMMC requirement. But what you need to be thinking about is, are you prepared to submit a CMMC self-assessment that meets all CMMC requirements as soon as November of this year? Because that is what is now possible with the Title 38 and the Title 48 rule taking effect. We're going to go into more detail in a little bit about why a CMMC self-assessment is different than a previous NIST 800-171 self-assessment, but in a nutshell, it's because there's a minimum score and there are either no POAMs allowed for level 1, or for level 2, the use of POAMs is very restricted. So in summary, the Title 48 final rule: no significant changes to the requirements, no delay. Implementation begins on November 10th. That is that precise date that is provided for the timeline to start. Any changes in that Title 48 rule really just added clarity and alignment in some terms. They also reinforced SPURS as a central repository, both for submitting a self-assessment as well as with the annual affirmation that is required from senior company leadership. So with that, let's get into the weeds a little bit and let's talk about self-assessments and what you're going to need to do with your organization. We've broken this out into some sections, and I'm going to turn it over to Charlie to help walk you through it.
Thanks, Bob. So first, let's go into the very first part of the self-assessment is the scoping requirements. So there's going to be different scoping requirements depending on which level you're going after. So level 1 and level 2. Level 1 is going to be around information systems that store and process and transmit CUI or FCI, I'm sorry. And then level 2 will be FCI and or CUI. Level 3 is all assets that can access CUI, and I'm going to go into that in a minute here. If you look at the breakout below, you've got your different asset categories, your definition of what those categories are, and then the examples, and then where they're applicable to each level of CMMC. FCI assets and CUI assets are very similar, except one is for FCI, one's for CUI. Assets that can store, process, or transmit. Got some examples there. Security protection assets, those are things that are used to secure a system. So maybe it's, antivirus, a SIM, system information and event monitoring is what that stands for. Multi-factor authentication. Those things that only have log files and log data, that is going to be something that's called security protection assets. So those are in scope. Contract or risk managed assets are usually assets that can store, process, transmit CUI, but they're not intended to because of some kind of security policy that you have enabled. And then finally, specialized assets. Specialized assets are those CNC machines, those machines that are on the shop floor that are from 1995 or 2005 or something like that, that have ancient, Windows versions of operating systems, Windows 2000, Windows XP, Windows 7, that can't easily be updated without spending a very, very large amount of money. So you can only secure them as much as you can. But that's really what you're looking at as far as scoping, and then also considering external service providers, which we'll get into in a later slide. So once you've got that scoping now you've got to define your system boundary. So that system boundary is a network diagram that will basically show your entire network infrastructure, okay? And if your entire network infrastructure is in scope, there's not really much else to do except show that entire network infrastructure. If there is a smaller subset, which it's called an enclave, where maybe you have a normal network where people are doing normal processing of just non-FCI or non-CUI data, and now you want to just have a smaller subset for that CUI information. So that would be that enclave. That would show that here's where I was talking about my scope, and that's that little box here that says enclave. That's where everything is. You want to just make sure when you're setting your boundary and you're setting your scope that you don't make any large changes following your certification. Reason that is if you do make a change in scope that is considered large enough, you will have to go through another certification assessment prior to that 3 years after getting your certification from a C3PAO. So on the next page, we'll talk about the next thing as part of scoping is your CUI flow diagram. So this is something that'll be looked at when you're talking with your C3PAO. You have to show how the CUI comes in and out of your organization. We just made an example here that just kind of shows here's what's in scope, here's what's out of scope, here's how the CUI flows in and out. Very simple diagram. It may be more complicated for other organizations, but this just kind of gives you a general idea of what's being looked for as far as a CUI flow diagram. Next, I did mention external service provider. So an external service provider, most of you think of an ESP as like an MSP or an MSSP. The DoD doesn't recognize those two acronyms, even though they recognize 1,000 more. So an ESP is basically people, technology, facilities that an organization uses for help with IT and cybersecurity services, okay? But on behalf of the organization. So if that ESP is using their assets to either access or store CUI or access CUI, not store, sorry, or security protection data, like I mentioned before, with security protection assets. If it processes, stores, and transmits those, by definition, they're an ESP. Okay, and so what that means is they are assessed as part of the OSA's assessment. So you will get from an ESP that's providing services for you a customer responsibility matrix or a share responsibility matrix. Just depends on they both mean the same thing. Shows all 110 controls with CMMC level 2. Shows all the objectives. Says, hey, this one, client, you're responsible for this. This one, maybe we share together. This one, I'm responsible for. And what will happen is if you list any external service providers that you're working with in your system as part of your SSP and your scoping, they'll want to see that the C3PAO will want to see that CRM and say, okay, well, now that you've shown me this, when it comes to those things that says the ESP is responsible or shared, now I'm going to assess what they're doing for you as part of the assessment. So just be mindful of that. And what also is important is I've talked about MSPs. Well, I haven't really talked about CSPs. So there's kind of a breakdown because it's what's a CSP, what's an ESP, what's an MSP. So a CSP is an ESP that's considered a cloud service provider only when it provides cloud services and those services have CUI stored, processed, or transmitted inside of them. So think of it as like you go out to like a Microsoft or an Amazon, AWS, and you're able to spin up cloud resources fairly quickly to be able to start processing and doing whatever you need to. That's considered a CSP. There's two ways an MSP can be involved in your scope. One is maybe that MSP only provides staff. So they come on site as a staffing model. They use your assets, your machines, your processes, all of that. So they will not need a CMMC assessment, and they will not be part of your the ESP will not be part of the scope. But if they access CUI on their assets or their tools, and they have that customer responsibility matrix that I mentioned, now they will be part of your certification assessment. So just some information there on MSPs and CSPs. Next part of that self-assessment is actually going through and doing the actual assessment, giving yourself a score and providing the evidence. So there is an assessment methodology that is followed for this, and we've got a link to the bottom of the slides. And if it hasn't been mentioned already, the slides will be available for distribution after the webinar. But this is off of the NIST 171 assessment methodology. Got a link to the PDF there. But what it does is it assigns a weight to every single control except one. And it gives it either a value of 1, 3, or 5. There are some that can have partial credit, only 2 of them. So what you do is you start with a full score of 110 as you start doing the assessment. And anytime an objective for a control is not met. So even if you have 6 objectives, if one of them is not met, now that means that that control is not met, and now you have to deduct points. So you start with a score of 110, and you do your deduction for every one of those things that's not met based on the weight of the actual control, and that will give you your score. Now we'll talk about, you have things that are not met. You create plan of action and milestones, or POAMs. So you can't have POAMs for conditional status, as Bob mentioned earlier. He did say level 1, no POAMs allowed. Very true. Level 2, very limited use. So you have to have 80% of the controls met, which is an 88 out of 110. Also, they can't be the highest weighted requirements, those 3 or 5 point controls. There are also 6 1-point controls that also are inside of that. So even though they're 1-pointers, they're considered non-poemable. I know it's not really a word, but that you can't add as a poem and be able to submit and get a score of 88 with POAMs. Those POAMs that are 1-pointers that are allowed, they're strictly time bound, have to be closed out within 180 days. That also means at certification, at the end of your certification assessment, if you have an 88, they're going to have to do recertification. They're going to have to check to make sure you've implemented your POAMs, and that can be an additional cost to you. Also, last line item is there are some controls that kind of complement each other. A lot of them in access control will complement identification and authentication controls. So you may want to look as you're building your plan to remediate POAM items that you do so, where controls actually affect one another. On the next slide, there's those non-poemable. I know it's not a word, but we like to use it. 1-point controls. So it shows those ones. That last one is not actually a 1-point control. We list it here just because the SSP is required for you to be able to submit a score. So if you don't have an SSP, you can't submit a score, and you basically have a score of, I guess it's not a score at all. So you can't submit a score to Spurs or anything like that. But part of this whole self-assessment is collecting that evidence. So what we did was, it should be based on that responsibility matrix I mentioned before. Here we've got an example of something from our responsibility matrix. This is for control IAL 2353 about multi-factor authentication. So here, the very first objective, privileged accounts are identified. This is your documentation showing how you're identifying your privileged accounts. And then the next 3 controls are how you have it implemented. Okay, so are you doing MFA for your local access to privileged accounts, network access to privileged accounts, and network access to non-privileged accounts? So as you're going through this, you're going to collect this evidence. Now, during a certification assessment, so let's say you're collecting all this body of evidence and you're going to get ready for that certification assessment. You'll have to hash that evidence. You'll have to provide that evidence to the C3PAO. You will also have to retain that artifact evidence for 6 years. Okay, so having a GRC tool is very helpful to be able to retain and organize that evidence. So now that we've got the evidence, we've gone through the self-assessment, now you got to submit the score. So to submit that score, here's what you need. We talked about that system security plan. Submissions invalid without it. You need to have a procurement integrated enterprise environment. We call it PIE. You need one of those accounts. Once you have an account there, that person that's submitting the score has to have the SPRS cyber vendor role, and it needs to be active. Sometimes you see it where it's inactive. So anyway, long story short, you have to have the date of the submission, that score we talked about, the scope of your assessment. So that scope can be enterprise, it can be enclave. You also have to have your cage code or codes if there's more than one cage code involved. And then if you do have a score of 88 or higher with one pointers, as far as your POAMs are concerned, the date you're going to get a 110. Okay. So now we're just going to go through, we're going to step through what it looks like when you go into PIE to submit this in Spurs. So first of all, at the very bottom of every one of these slides, we have a link to the quick entry guide for level 2. This is available on, and we did a lot of this from that guide. So again, cyber vendor, user role has to be assigned. Once you go to PIE, you log in. When you log in, you get a blue landing page. You'll have icons for what's available for you to be able to access. SPRS, Supplier Performance Risk System, is what you click on that icon. And then it brings you to another window, which brings you into SPRS. On the left-hand side, you've got a column. You'll click Cyber Reports. After clicking Cyber Reports, on the next slide, Bob, you'll start to submit your assessment. So what I'm going to do here is we went ahead and showed how you would get to those assessments. So you'll select your cage code, and it should be linked with your SAM database where you've got all of your cage codes. If you have more than one, you select your cage code, and then you hit Run Cyber Reports. On the lower screenshot, you'll have the different kind of reports that you can submit or have submitted, and you'll go to CMMC assessments. So this first set of screenshots shows how you submit for level 1. So you would just go ahead and hit to the level 1 self tab that's at the bottom, and you'll go ahead and submit your score. Here you're going to list your assessment date, the scope. This is where you would select enclave or enterprise. How many employees are in the organization? Are you compliant? Making sure the cage codes are selected, and then you just continue to affirmation. So that there it basically brings up all the information, and you hit continue to affirmation again, and you've affirmed for the most part for level 1. For level 2, after you select your cage code, is a little different. So it brings up all the different domains in CMMC level 2, NIST 800-171 revision 2, and all the different controls. So you have to go through them control by control and select the compliance status. You also have a way that you can look at the requirement objectives to make sure that you've got all the right information. As you go through and you put all the information in for the 110 controls, you'll hit save and continue. Now, once you hit save and continue on that, now it's going to come to hey, I'm going to just kind of show you all of this. Here's what you inputted. If something's missing, you need to make sure you put that in before you can actually submit. So it'll give you a little warning if something's missing. So you've got that chance to review. And once you're reviewed, it'll go ahead and say, okay, well, now I need to know what your scope is. So assessing scope here in the example, it shows enclave. Again, it asks for the number of employees. If there's multiple cages, you can select additional cages. And in this case, and when you click open cage hierarchy or just one, save and continue. And then once you do that, now it's going to say, I've computed your final score that you've submitted. Here's your final score. Make sure that's right. It shows that once affirmed, the assessment will be valid for 180 days because it's conditional. If you had a score of 110, it would be valid for 1 year. Now you'll click on continue to affirmation, and that's where it looks very similar to the level 1 affirmation, where you can go ahead and affirm. You can go ahead and say, I certify that the statement above is true, and you can affirm. Like I mentioned earlier, this is an annual thing. So once you have a score of 110, you will have to reaffirm this annually, meaning you have to do the self-assessment every year to make sure you're still in compliance. Okay. Once you've done that, it'll take you back to that summary page that we saw on the first page where it shows the different levels of CMMC. So you have now, it shows CMMC level 2 self, and it shows what you inserted. You are able to delete and edit and look at the details after it's been submitted. So just remember that final self-assessment is only visible to government personnel. The final level 1 self-assessment will automatically become no CMMC status after it expires after 1 year. So again, you've got to go through and put in your new self-assessment every year. This is a process you'll have to follow. And then once you actually get a level 2 certification assessment that's actually put in by a C3PAO, you will actually have to go in annually and affirm, and it's valid for 3 years. Once that 3 years comes up, you'll have to go through your certification assessment and do that process all over again. Some tips. If you have an issue where you don't have a cage code, or maybe you don't see that, and sometimes you have to go and make sure that SPRS cyber vendor user set to active. Sometimes it's not set to active, and when you can actually still go to SPRS, but nothing shows up. If you do have an issue that requires getting PIEs, help desk involved, they have an option to submit an email or call. I would let you know it's better to call. You get a better response that way. And then if you still can't see anything in step 3, there may be an issue with your cage code, or you might have to go to SAM and see if there's some issue there. So that might actually involve SAM's help desk. So we've got all the other information as far as links and phone numbers on this page to go to PIE, their help desk, SPRS, all of that's listed here as well as the quick reference guides as well.
Thank you, Charlie. Everybody got all that? I know that was a lot of info. It's a lot of great detail. And as Charlie said, he and his team have put that together. We will be sending that out. We did get a couple questions as we were going through that, Charlie, that if you don't mind, I think it would be good while the info is timely to just ask you about them. One was, for all intents and purposes, the same process that a C3PAO is following in terms of a certification assessment, organizations are going to need to go through to submit a self-assessment. Is that accurate?
That's accurate.
So yeah, it's a lot different than the previous NIST 801 assessment and score, where you just needed to submit your score, the date you would have a perfect score, and then have the supporting poems. This is a lot more granular. Another question that came up, and I said we wanted to answer it live, was asking about NIST 80171 Rev 3, and if there was anything in here yet to submit for that. Can you explain a little bit where we are with that?
Okay, so Rev 3, yes, it's out. It does have a different number of controls. Some controls have been combined. There's additional domains that have been added that came in from NIST 800-53. There's also organizational defined parameters. All of these things are new with revision 3. But with NIST 800-171 revision 2 and CMMC level 2, those are tied together until the full rollout is complete. So CMMC level 2 will be assessed against, and level 1 and level 3, and those additional controls we mentioned earlier, those will be assessed against those 110 controls of CMMC level 2. It will be assessed against those. Now, whether you want to have policy documentation that integrates revision 3 to you, that's great. You can do that and be prepared for Rev 3 when it comes out, but you're going to be assessed to level 2, or to NIST 800-171 revision 2 until the final rollout of all in contracts is complete.
Thank you, Charlie. Another question that just came in, and this ties into our next subject, accuracy, was I believe we have to meet all 110 controls. Thought he saw something that said 80% of the controls need to be met. You do need to meet all 110 controls. That 80% equates to the minimum score of 88, that if you only have poems for the 1-point controls that you're allowed to have poems, you can proceed with the certification process as conditional, but you are still going to need to meet all 110 controls. So that has not changed. So thinking about that, why does accuracy matter? It's no longer just about, oh, it's lost revenue or it's future revenue that I'm not going to be able to participate in or be eligible for if I can't submit a CMMC self-assessment or get certified. There are increasing legal risks. We're going to share some info on this, and there's one particular case that I would encourage everybody to Google and read up on the specifics. But the False Claims Act is framed in the 7021 clause specifically as a condition of contract award. It will be required that there is current CMMC certification at the appropriate level. There is also affirmation of current compliance by a senior official annually. So again, that certification assessment is not meant to be just a snapshot in time. It is something that you will need to continuously on an annual basis go out as a senior leader in your company and affirm that we're still doing all of these things. You must maintain that CMMC compliant state for the duration of the contract and require that any subcontractors you're using do the same. And as a reminder, all of the previous requirements remain fully effective during this rollout. So if you've had something that has the DFARS 7012 clause, which means NIST 800-171 has been in effect since 2017, you're still subject to those terms, even if your ticket hasn't been called yet for a CMMC self-assessment or certification assessment. So keep in mind, there is legal exposure, not just moving forward, but also for the current state. Doubling down on that, DOD and DOJ have been working together with DOJ setting up a cyber fraud initiative a couple of years ago. That has led to over 28 million recovered from companies for settling False Claims Act claims and 5 million paid out to whistleblowers. So you see some notable cases below. I would encourage everyone on this call to Google the Morse Corp case and see the specifics that were involved there. and how an organization might have fallen into that knowing or unknowing state of misrepresenting cybersecurity compliance, because there are some very real risks that companies can find themselves in today as it relates to attesting to and submitting this information. So lastly, as we get into some of the things that organizations can do to prepare themselves and to meet these requirements, just tying it all back, if you were waiting, it's time to take action. The requirements haven't changed. The rollout timeline, as it was laid out in that Title 32 rule last year, Title 48 did not change that. And you really need to be looking at picking an RPO or a C3PAO like you would pick a surgeon. Expertise and experience matter here. Choosing someone that has been through a certification assessment themselves. Choosing a certification assessor that is familiar with the technologies that you have in your environment and has assessed those as part of a certification assessment. That can help streamline the process. How SSE is helping our clients is we try to meet them wherever they are. For those that are just starting out, we offer a complimentary initial readiness assessment. For those that are in the stage of, hey, we've done a lot of things, we now need to validate it against these requirements and see where we are and if we're prepared to make a submission, to really update our SSP and get everything documented, to have true POAMs or OPAs for the unmet or partially met requirements. That gap assessment is a critical engagement now more than ever for organizations that are preparing to submit or even go through a certification assessment. Remediation, this could be technical things, this could be the addition or replacement of tools or partners that Charlie mentioned may not meet FedRAMP or FIPS requirements that would cause an organization to fail an audit. Continuous monitoring, the ongoing steady state of compliance, that is a key piece and a much heavier lift than organizations may realize and think, oh, my IT team can take this on. There is some nuance and some specificity involved there that can be eye-opening as folks really get into it. And then just that strategic planning and the compliance management, right? Great question on NIST 800-171 Rev 3. Hey, I'm meeting all the requirements for Rev 2 and CMMC Level 2. What should I be looking at 18 months, 2 years from now to plan for Rev 3 and when those requirements start to come into the fold? Depending on where our clients are, we're working with them continuously through these steps. How long does it take? We get asked this all the time. Ballpark. Readiness assessment, we can turn around in a week or two. Gap assessment is typically a month. Remediation, 2 to 3 months. Ongoing support, 1 to 2 months, depending what's needed. Wrapping it all up, plan on 3 to 6 months for a mature IT environment, 6 to 9 months for a not so mature IT environment. So think about that related to the timeline slide earlier in this discussion. And what is your organization's plan for when you want to become certified? And then back out to where we are and how much time do you have? How much time are you still going to need? Related to those risks, we do want to hone in on one particular engagement that RPOs can deliver. Why do I say RPOs? Can a C3PAO do a preliminary assessment? Absolutely. But they may not be able to provide the consulting on how you would need to remediate any unmet or partially met requirements and then still be your C3PAO for the certification assessment they would conduct. That's a role that was designed for the RPOs. So typically an RPO is going to be able to provide you deliverables such as this, information for an SSP. It's got the control, it's got the implementation status, it's got the details as to how the specific objectives within that control were met or not met. And again, thinking about to when Charlie walked us through submitting that self-assessment, these are things you're now going to have to do control by control. For anything that is not met or partially met, the gap assessment will deliver what's now known as an operational plan of action. Used to be a POAM, but POAMs can now only technically come from a formal certification assessment. Why is this important? Because this is going to allow you to see what you're not meeting or what you're not fully meeting. Perhaps you thought you were, and if those are 5-point, 3-point, or 1-point controls. In other words, do I need to remediate this now, Or is this something that I may be able to carry forward as a conditional POAM during my certification? All of that is going to tie into the score, which you will need, and it is validated by having that SSP detail and those POAMs or OPAs. Lastly, think about prime contractors and the flow down requirements and the responsibilities that primes now have to ensure their subs are also meeting these requirements. Self-serving slide, but it's something we're very proud of. I make light of this all the time, but SSE does have deep experience, not just in cybersecurity services, IT, ISO, but in DoD contracting. Now almost 20 years. We are an RPO. We do have CCPs, CCAs on staff. We have been CMMC Level 2 certified ourselves, and we are working towards becoming a C3PAO as well. Probably sometime in 2026, that process will be finalized, and we'll also be able to assist clients in other ways that we haven't thus far, actually doing their certification assessments. So wrapping up, what are the key questions that we would recommend organizations seeking compliance ask of themselves and their partners? Scope, Charlie nailed it. What is the required scope? Is it FCI? Is it CUI? Is it enclave? Is it enterprise-wide? It may be enterprise-wide now, but there could be an opportunity to design an enclave and only apply those controls to that particular section of your environment rather than enterprise-wide. If that is possible, there could be some cost and operational efficiencies that you can find with that approach. Do you have a current NIST score on record with the government in SPURS? Do you have supporting documentation to validate it? How old is it? What do those POAMs look like? Are they 3-pointers, 5-pointers, 1-pointers? Do you know how long and what it's going to take to remediate them? What about your current vendors? Have you vetted them out? Have you had conversations with your MSP, CSP partners as to whether the tools and services that they're providing for you meet FedRAMP moderate or FIPS requirements? If they are pulled in to be part of your certification assessment, are they going to be able to represent those things and speak to the C3PAO accordingly in order to help you pass? Those are conversations you want to be having now versus during that audit and risk any surprises. But as it relates to the subject today, submitting CMMC self-assessments, could you submit one now with a score of 110, speaking about level 2, or for level 1, perfect, no POAMs for any controls, in order to secure or maintain work supporting DoD contracts? Do you plan on bidding on anything new later this year, Q1 of next year? Has your prime told you, hey, be ready for this, we're working on this, there's going to be a new PO or separate tier of this award coming out? Well, if you needed to submit a CMMC self-assessment, would you be able to do so? And if not, how much time do you need and how much time do you still have? So with that, we are going to regroup and kind of go through some of the questions that we have. Charlie, I'm going to ask you to pull back in. I believe you've answered some. One that I know gets asked a lot is if you could explain FedRAMP moderate and how certain clouds meet that and certain don't.
Okay, so the FedRAMP Marketplace is a way to go check this. I'll just let you know that if you do a Google search for FedRAMP Marketplace, you can go ahead and search companies and see if they have certification. But FedRAMP is basically a moderate streamlining of NIST 800-53. So it's 325 controls. I can't remember the number of objectives off the top of my head. I know it's over 1,000. But what has to happen for those companies that are meeting FedRAMP moderate or FedRAMP moderate equivalency is they have to go through, they have to be compliant with all those controls, have an SSP for that. They have to contract not a C3PAO, but a FedRAMP 3PAO. And they have to go ahead and do the certification assessment. They have to go through and do a certain pen test that 3PAOs do for FedRAMP organizations. Then once that's done, it has to go to the PMO for approval. That process takes a long time, a lot of money. So that has to be there for cloud service providers that are, storing, processing, transmitting CUI or export control data. It's all in the DFAR 7012 clause. So equivalency would mean you have all of that, but you haven't gone to the PMO, and you can provide that attestation for review by a C3PAO during assessment.
Thank you, Charlie. Another couple that it looks like you've responded via the chat, but I think for good of the group, we probably want to talk about. You said that this November 10th date is for new contracts. Is there any hard due date for old contracts? Great question. The slide that had the timeline broke down. Phase 1 starts November 10th of this year. Self-assessments, new contracts. Phase 2, certification assessments, speaking for level 2, for new contracts. That would start 1 year from the start of phase 1, so November 10th, 2026. Phase 3, that would be when those option periods start to be exercised. So now you're talking about existing contracts. Now that would be a year after phase 2, so now you're talking about November 10th, 2027. But you referenced a hard date. No, there's not a hard date, because in the Title 48 rule, they provided the DoD contracting officer full discretion to add the CMMC requirements to any contract at any time, starting November 10th, this Monday. So it is possible that an existing contract could have those CMMC requirements added to it much newer. Well, that may not seem fair, but think about CMMC level 2. It is aligned with NIST 800-171 Rev 2, which has been required since the end of 2017. So from the DoD's perspective, these are requirements that have been in place for many years. It is just now the enforcement of them in order to be eligible to participate in contracts that is changing. So if you have questions specifically about your existing contracts, go to your contracting officer, go to your prime contractor, and ask those questions. I can't promise you will get definitive answers, but that would be the source you need to go to have those conversations. Charlie, we were also asked a question about the number of RPOs and C3PAOs as it relates to the overall defense industrial base and the number of companies that are going to need certification. And I liked the follow-up to this is, i.e., is there a risk of waiting? You provided some thoughts on that. If you'd like to share them with the group here, please.
Yeah, there's only 83 confirmed C3PAOs. Bob mentioned 80,000 level 2 certifications. The numbers don't compute. What the Cyber AB is looking at right now is they're looking at getting as many CCAs, certified CMMC assessors, for those C3PAOs to use to speed up assessments. Because in order for a C3PAO to become a C3PAO, they've got to go through things themselves. We're going through it ourselves as well. One of those is a DIPCAC high assessment that is done by DIPCAC. It's basically a CMMC assessment, but DIPCAC has to perform it. The government, DCMA, has to do that. And so it's still open during the government shutdown, but they can only go so fast. They have limited resources. So how quick are they going to be able to certify new C3PAOs? I don't know. So if you wait, the issue will be, okay, well, now I'm ready for my certification assessment. I got everything done. I'm ready. Well, now you're in line for 7 or 8 months because everybody else is in line in front of you. So you may miss something you're bidding on. So if you get awarded that contract and you say, hey, I'm still in line for my certification assessment, sorry, we're going to give it to somebody else. That's just kind of how it's going to work, unfortunately.
Thank you, Charlie. We are right up on time here, but we did get one more question. I want to answer it live. If we are only supplying government surplus parts and not a manufacturer, are our parts exempt, or do we fall under the definition of commercial off-the-shelf products, etc.? So the answer is, and Charlie, you can weigh in on this as well, you could be exempt if it's COTS. You could also fall under CMMC level 1 versus level 2 if it is just FCI, federal contract information, and there's a specific clause that you can look for in your existing contract purchase orders, et cetera. It's literally taped to the wall behind me. It's a FAR clause. Feel free to reach out. Our email and contact info is on the screen. We can dig deeper into that. But if you have any CUI involved in the nature of that work, drawing specs, et cetera, and if you do have that DFAR 7012 clause, that means that the contracting officer is stating that CUI is part of the work that's being done here, and that NIST 800-171 is required now, and CMMC level 2 would be required moving forward. So check your agreements for those contract clauses to see what is required now, and then also follow up, as I referenced earlier, with your contracting officer or with your prime contractor. Folks, we are right up at 11:45. Again, contact info is on the screen. We are happy to help answer any additional questions you may have. Our team is available. We thank you for joining us. We probably will be having another session in December once the Title 48 rule has gone live and with the latest updates from the DoD and Cyber AB. Until then, for Elizabeth Niedringhaus, our President and CEO, for Charlie, myself, thank you all very much for joining us this morning.
Hey guys, bye-bye.